Hi class, in this recording we're going to dive in and start talking about the brain. So let's get started. As we look at the brain, we first need some orientation. So these terms can be used for the brain. Generally speaking, I use for directional terminology anterior and posterior, but these are some hold-offs from the quadruped terminology that is still present in some of human anatomy and physiology. So as we're looking at rostral, this term rostral means that it's going to be towards the forehead. Generally speaking, I'll use anterior as opposed to rostral, but rostral implies anterior and superior. If we wanted to be really specific about it. When we look at caudal, caudal implies towards the spinal cord. A more technical definition would be inferior and posterior. So if you hear somebody saying costal, or excuse me, caudal versus rostral, that's what those two terms are referring to. Now, as we look at the brain, there are some differences in the mass of the brain. Generally speaking, men have a brain that's about 3.5 pounds versus a brain that's about 3 pounds in women, or 3.2 pounds. We have about 16,000, 1.6 kilograms in men, 1.4 kilograms in women. Generally speaking, the difference in this mass on average is just due to the size of the cranial vault. Males, in generally speaking, have larger skulls, and larger skulls mean larger brains, and males generally have larger bodies, and because they have larger bodies, they need more processing to help control that larger body. It's also worth noting, though, that just because there's different volumes and masses in the brain doesn't necessarily mean that males versus females are more intelligent. When it comes to IQ tests, females, generally speaking, outperform males in nearly every IQ test across the board, and especially when we look at things like high school graduation rates, college graduation rates, percentages of students graduating with high honors, females, generally speaking, are beating males at about a 60-40 split. So in many respects, in terms of academic performance, females are outperforming males, generally speaking. Let's talk about the three major parts of the brain. We have the cerebrum. The cerebrum sometimes is referred to just as the left and right hemispheres or left right brain. This is the bulk of the brain. So when people talk about the brain, generally speaking, they're talking about the cerebrum. It's 83% of the total volume of our brains. It makes up a very large portion of our overall brain's mass. As we look at the cerebrum, it's broken into left right hemispheres. There are gyri, which are the small ridges, sulci, which is the small indentations. We have a really big indentation called the longitudinal fissure right down the middle, and then we have the corpus callosum. As we look at the cerebellum, and I'm going to skip to the next slide here. This will make it a little bit easier. So here we have the cerebrum, this big, large portion. Gyri are the ridges, sulci are the indentations. As we look at the cerebellum is going to be located here. It's going to be more caudal, not quite as caudal as the brainstem, but the cerebellum is going to have very small sulci, very small ridges in it. Small sulci, small gyri in it. And then we have the brainstem. Brainstem is shown down here at the bottom. We can see the medulla oblongata, and then the pons, and then the midbrain is completely covered up in this figure. As we look at the surface of the brain, that longitudinal fissure, it goes longitudinally down the brain. A question a lot of students ask me is, what's the difference between a fissure versus a sulci? And a good way to help differentiate these is depth. As we look at this fissure, it's right here. Here's the longitudinal fissure going down the center or down the mid-sagittal plane of the brain. And a fissure is very deep. Fissures are deep. Sulci are shallow. So that's how we can differentiate a fissure versus a sulci. And as we look at these ridge, so the peak is going to be the gyri. In the brain, there's going to be a bundle of tracts, a bunch of white matter that connects the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum. This is known as the corpus callosum. There's a lot of preliminary research that has shown that based on the proportions, females have a larger corpus callosum than males. So proportionally, females have better connections between the left and right hemispheres of the brain compared to males. This research is still being continued, but as brain scan technology improves, we're being able to collect more data points on that topic. As we look at the cerebellum, that's the part of the brain that's located back here. As we can see in that mid-sagittal slice, that mid-cerebellum is going to be housed primarily by the occipital bone. So if we think of where the spinal cord is exiting the brain right here, that spinal cord is going to be exiting through the foramen magnum, which means we have the occipital bone right here. Now, as we look at that cerebellum, even though it's not that big, it's about 10% of the brain volume, it's going to have about 50% of the brain neurons. So when we look at neuron density, the cerebellum has the highest density of neurons of any other part of our brain. As we look at the cerebellum, it's overwhelmingly going to be made of gray matter, which we'll talk about in a little bit, as opposed to white matter. That helps to explain the density of the neurons. We also have the brainstem, and as we look at the brainstem, I'm going to shift colors here. Let's go with bright green because that's a fun color. So our brainstem is right here. It goes up. And we'll have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and then the midbrain. And let me put some dividing lines there. So in red, down here, we have the medulla oblongata. In yellow, we have the pons. And then in bright red, we have the, in bright red, we have the midbrain. And then the diencephalon, which is much more difficult to get to, it's typically going to be buried in the middle of the brain, is located about right here. Sometimes the diencephalon is categorized as a separate part from the brainstem, a separate region of the brain. Other times the diencephalon is going to be combined with the midbrain. For lecture, we take the diencephalon and combine it with the brain so it will be consistent with your lecture textbook, but there is a distinction in lab. In lab, we separate out the diencephalon from the brainstem as one of the 4 major regions of the brain. So be advised, there's a slight discrepancy here between lecture and lab in our class. Oh, I went a little too far there. Let me back up a slide here. Previous. So as we look at, and unfortunately my figure didn't load here. As we look at the gray matter versus the white matter, I'm actually going to back up another slide here. Let's go previous, previous, previous. Here we go. So as we look at gray matter is typically going to be located along the surface of the brain, the surface of the cerebrum. That gray matter is going to be considered processing matter. And as we look at gray matter is where we are going to have the body of the neuron, or the neurosoma, cell body of the neuron. We're also going to have many dendrites in the gray matter. Gray matter is also going to have most of the processing. So when we think of processing or computer processing, or the thinking part of our brain, where we have integration, that's going to be the gray matter. And the reason it's gray is because it has very little myelin. Myelin is a lipid-rich material produced by the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system and serves to electrically insulate the axons. We're going to have faster conduction or traveling or movement of information or action potentials. The white matter in the brain is going to be regions of the brain. So we could have the corpus callosum right here. We also have the arbor vitae in the cerebellum. And that white matter is going to be made primarily of axons. So because the white matter is made primarily of myelinated axons, and myelin is lipid rich, it has a white color to it and gives the white matter its namesake, the white coloration of the white matter. Because it's made of primarily axons, we think of white matter in a word as the transmission matter. So gray matter helps to integrate or process information. It helps to form the nuclei. And when we think of a nuclei, it's just a bunch of cell bodies of neurons grouped together in the central nervous system. Within the brain, white matter is going to be tracts. So when we think of tracts, it's just a group of axons in the central nervous system. So gray matter processes information, white matter transmits information. And that's all we have for our lecture recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them on the class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.